On our last program, we introduced the high holy days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. These are observed the first 10 days of Tishri, a Jewish calendar month corresponding to our September. Beginning with the new moon of September, for the first 10 days, the Jews observe what is called the high holy days. Rosh Hashanah in the Bible is called the Feast of Trumpets, and Yom Kippur in the Bible is called the Day of Atonement. These 10 days are very important prophetically. They represent the days of the tribulation period. It is believed that Jesus Christ, in his second coming, will fulfill the prophecies of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. As we look at the book of Revelation, we open in chapters 4 and 5 with a Rosh Hashanah ritual, and we close the books with chapter 19 with the second coming of Christ on a Yom Kippur ritual. These things are obvious in the book of Revelation. The question that we are entertaining today is, what about the rapture of the church? Gary Sturm is here to discuss with me the mystery of the rapture.
And J.R., the rapture is not depicted in the events of Rosh Hashanah, and neither do we find a rescue per se. The theme of the rapture is to take a people apart during a time of great judgment. Rosh Hashanah takes people through a kind of purification. And we find in Daniel 12, chapter 7, when the angel is speaking with Daniel, he says this, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half, and when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. So Daniel's 70th week will be finished with the scattering of the power of the holy people. Now that holy people, of course, is Israel. And yes, they are brought low. They're brought to a point where they have to recognize that God is their Redeemer through grace, not by any works of their own.
Now, the Apostle Paul spoke of the rapture of the church, the resurrection of the dead, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and he said, the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God. This evidently is a Rosh Hashanah, or at least Rosh Hashanah, Feast of Trumpets, is a type of this sort of thing. Now, this is not to say that the rapture will occur on a Rosh Hashanah. What I am saying is, and what we're saying, is that when we get to heaven, after the rapture, then we will observe a Rosh Hashanah ritual, which we can see in Revelation chapters 4, 5, and 6. And the point is, we've got to already be there, Gary, when this ceremony takes place.
Absolutely, for 2 or 3 reasons, not the least of which is liturgical, because the action of the high priest requires that he be totally involved in his work. And last time we mentioned, for example, that the Lamb opening the book really is a reenactment of that which happens every Rosh Hashanah when the books are open. And then we find, of course, the trumpets in Revelation, reenactment of the trumpets of Rosh Hashanah. We come to the vials of Revelation later on, and we find incense being poured on an altar of incense. We find the ark opened up in heaven. All of these are the trip or the liturgical duty of the high priest through the temple in heaven. And this then brings to pass the events called the Great Tribulation. But J.R., we are watching this from an incredible vantage point.
Yes.
We can see this from heaven itself.
And this is the point that we want to make. For you see, some today teach a mid-tribulation rapture, some a post-tribulation rapture, and others a pre-wrath rapture, or wrath being sometime between the middle and the end of the tribulation period. Our contention is that we will already be in heaven before the tribulation period begins. Not just moments before, maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe years before. Gary, the great scholars of this century have all pointed to some time taking place between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation period, don't they?
And that's because the beginning of the tribulation period is marked by the emergence of the man of sin, as Paul calls him, or the Antichrist, as John calls him. We read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 some very key verses. And the verses have to do with the revelation of the man of sin. For the mystery of iniquity, 2 Thessalonians 2:7, for the mystery of iniquity doth already work, only he who now letteth will let until he be taken out of the way, and then shall that wicked be revealed. And the idea is not before then. Now, John Walvoord, in his book, The Rapture Question, makes a very interesting statement, and I'm going to quote a short passage. Referring to the words I just read in the Bible, he says, this passage teaches that the order of events is as follows. Number 1, the restrainer is now engaged in restraining sin. Number 2, the restrainer is taken away at a future point in time. Number 3, then the man of sin can be revealed. Inasmuch as the man of sin is identified with the world ruler, the ruler who will come, Daniel 9:26, it should be clear to students of prophecy that the restrainer must be taken away before the beginning of the last 7 years of Daniel's prophecy. So here, John F. Walvoord implies that there is a gap. Something cannot happen in a day. For example, a political movement takes a while to develop. Political movements, revolutions, juggling of power structures and so forth may take weeks, months, I think more like years before the Antichrist can actually come to the point of power, that being the time when he signs the covenant with the holy people, as mentioned in Daniel. So there is a gap implied there.
We also have other sources of modern theologians who show the possibility of a gap. Now, this reference to a gap you mean is years.
Years. As a matter of fact, Dwight Pentecost, in his magnificent work called Things to Come, referring to the restrainer, says, thus this ministry of the restrainer, which will continue as long as his temple is on earth, and which must cease before the lawless one can be revealed, requires the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. For Daniel 9:27 reveals that the lawless one will be manifested at the beginning of the week. He says the same thing. If the lawless one comes right at the beginning of the week, then some time must have elapsed for him to be in that position. And I'm going to quote a third paragraph here from Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, The Footsteps of the Messiah. Regarding the same passage, he says this: the relationship of the rapture to the tribulation must be clearly focused in the mind. The rapture precedes the tribulation, but it does not begin the tribulation, a fact confused by many pre-tribulationists. It is not the rapture, he writes, but the 7-year covenant which begins the tribulation. The rapture will merely come sometime before this and may very well precede the tribulation by a good number of years. End quote, Arnold Fruchtenbaum. He says a good number of years. What would be a good number of years?
Yeah, good question. Now, the point is, we believe that the tribulation period will be 7 years long, corresponding to the 70th week of Daniel. But wait a minute. There are 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the first 10 days of Tishri, corresponding to our September. Is that 7 years, or is it 10 years? Does this represent not just 7 years of tribulation, but 10 years of time? If so, then the rapture of the church has to take place before the 10th year, shall we say 10 and a half years, in the 11 years before the Battle of Armageddon. Is it possible? Now, we're not trying to be dogmatic here, but the point is, the rapture of the church must precede these things. That's the important point.
Yeah, we're almost talking about a pre-tribulation rapture here. We're almost saying that the blessed hope is a whole lot more blessed than you might have thought before now. Can you imagine the blessing of escaping not just the day of God's wrath, J.R., but the events leading up to the day of God's wrath, which must in themselves be pretty horrible.
And it's interesting that a Jewish marriages always take place on Wednesday. Some suggested Wednesday afternoon. Others say Tuesday night. Well, that Tuesday night is still Wednesday because Wednesday begins at sundown Tuesday evening. The point is this, that's the day before Thursday. And so if the tribulation period is a Sunday through a Saturday, a week, so to speak, Daniel's 70th week, and the week, of course, is typical of the years, then Rosh Hashanah would be 10 days before that on Thursday, and there's 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, that'd be Thursday and Friday, you see. If the wedding takes place on Wednesday, that means we're going to get out of here before the Rosh Hashanah ritual, which begins 10 years before Armageddon. I hope this hasn't been confusing to you. Simply to say, however, that we don't have to have the rapture of the church 1 second, and the next second we've got the tribulation period. There's more. We'll be back in just a moment. Don't go away. The Jewish high holy days from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur are comprised of 10 days. We can see a Rosh Hashanah ritual in Revelation 5. We can see a Yom Kippur ritual in chapters 14 and following through chapter 19. Are there 10 years represented by these 10 days? If so, what about the other days? What about the month of Elul that precedes Tishri? Or the month of Av and Tammuz that precedes that? Gary, there is a time when the spies came back on the 9th of Av in the book of Numbers, and God specified that those days would be turned into years. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, the spies came back, Numbers 14, 33 and 34, and your children shall wander in the wilderness 40 years, and bear your whoredoms, till your carcasses be wasted in the wilderness. After the number of days in which ye searched in the land, even 40 days, each day for a year, shall ye bear your iniquities, even 40 years, and ye shall know my breach of promise. Yeah. Fascinating principle.
Yes, because it is a principle that continues. It just doesn't refer to the Exodus. You see, every prophecy in the Bible has a double fulfillment. God has a purpose for all that he does. Well, let's take a look at the calendar, for example. Let's go back to the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av, corresponding 9 days after the new moon of late July. This would be probably early August, first few days of August, when it comes around in the Jewish calendar. The Jews have observed 3 weeks, 21 days, they called the dark time, beginning with the 17th day of Tammuz, and going 21 days through to the 9th of Av. Historically, these represent the days of the rejection. For example, 17th of Tammuz, the golden calf. And so we can see God's judgment upon them. It was during this time, for example, in 606 to 587 BC, when, for example, the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem and burned Solomon's temple to the ground on the 9th of Av. The Romans burned Herod's temple to the ground in AD 70, also on the 9th of Av, after a siege from the 17th of Tammuz to the 9th of Av. 3 weeks of the most horrendous time in Israel's history. Suppose those were years. We counted back in the calendar. Let's pick a good date. 1948. Would it fit?
Well, 1948 Israeli statehood. Now, what we're doing is laying out Israel's modern history along the lines of the Jewish calendar, each day for a year, just as Moses has it in Numbers 14, the passage we just read. And remember now, we're counting sort of backward here, going back to year 1948, which would be, what point on the calendar are we talking
about? The 9th of Av. You see, the first 9 days of Av are the really bad time, from the 1st of Av to the 9th. In fact, Chaim Schaus writes in his book on the Jewish holy days, quote, during the 9 days between the new moon and Tisha B'Av, that'd be the 9th of Av, the restrictions are so severe that all bathing is forbidden and no meat may be eaten. The lack of meat is not a great hardship on the Jews of the town. Nobody eats much meat during the hot summer months. But the ban on bathing really causes hardship, for these are the hottest days of the year. No matter what the heat or how strongly the sun burns, nobody goes to the river. Who would dream of bathing during the 9 days when the Jews mourn over the destruction of the temple? Now, could this represent the 9 years from, say, 1939, 1940 to 1948? These would be the Holocaust under Adolf Hitler. Certainly a dark time for the Jews.
And, by the way, that's what that's called, the dark time. And, you know, if we overlay this period on the Jewish calendar and then continue to count back a day for a year, some amazing things emerge. And then a little later, we're going to count forward again.
Yeah. What if we went back, for example, to the days of Pentecost? That would take us back to 1885 through 1891, depending on when the time frame for the day of Pentecost to be observed. And it was during that time that the Jews were going back home to the Promised Land. During that time, Theodor Herzl was preparing to publish his paper Judenstaat. And the first Zionist Congress would soon be held. It was a few years before that, in 1882, when the first 14 Jews left Kharkov, Russia, going back home to the Promised Land in what historically has been called the First Aliyah. So we really have a neat time here. You know, Pentecost is the time for reclaiming the land. That's what Naomi did when she came back.
We have that in the book of Ruth, and also Pentecost is the traditional time for change of dispensation. The law was given on Pentecost. Of course, the church was born on Pentecost. So here we find a huge change taking place in Israel. They're beginning to come back to the land.
Yeah. So if we began a year for a day, Pentecost would fall somewhere in the 1880s, leading up to this incredible First Zionist Congress in 1897. And moving on forward, for example, this dark time would begin in 1927. And even before then, when the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem and Solomon's temple, would correspond to 1917 and the liberation of Jerusalem. What a fantastic time for looking at this calendar, representing a day in the calendar and a year in history, at least modern history.
So we have the dark time, the Jewish calendar, falling from 1927 to 1947. 49.
48, actually.
48.
Yeah, it's the birth.
21
the birth
days
of
being, 21 years, the birth of Israel. J.R., let's go forward from there.
Wait a minute. Before we do that, let me show you something here. Chaim Schaus writes, in Jewish tradition, but a people cannot live on memories of the woes of the past. It must also have hopes for brighter and happier futures. For this reason, that the belief came current among Jews that the Messiah was born on the day of the destruction of the temple. The month of Av is therefore called Menachem Av, the name Menachem meaning comforter. In other words, they believe that the Messiah will be born on the 9th of Av. Well, listen, 1948, corresponding to this calendar, a year for a day, not the Messiah, but the nation of Israel was born, the nation that would be redeemed. Yeah. Fantastic how this thing fits, Gary.
I wish we had another hour to talk. We just have a few minutes. If we count forward a year for a day, the Jewish calendar, J.R., we come to a very, very significant event. 1967, the Six-Day War. And this is also marked out in a fascinating way on the calendar.
Yeah. You see, on the Sabbath that precedes the first of Elul, Chaim Schaus writes, quote, the attitude during the entire month of Elul is already an earnest and sober one, and all feel that soon the solemn days will begin. But undercurrents of the coming holidays are felt even earlier, on Sabbath, at which the blessing for the new moon, that of Elul, is recited. Well, Gary, that fits. This Sabbath before would be 1965, 1966, and he says, one knows that very soon, in just a few days, the shofar will be heard. For you see, the shofar is blown on the first of Elul. Well, 1967, the shofar was blown, that historic shofar by Shlomo Goren at the Western Wall at the liberation of East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount.
That's right. The Temple Mount was liberated in the time corresponding on the calendar to the first of Elul. And J.R., the month of Elul is marked among the extremely observant Jews by a time of penitential reverence. It's called slichot. and it means that prayers of supplication are offered during this time, and also that trumpet that blew in 1967.
Yeah,
was,
and Jerusalem then becomes the point of contention as God makes Jerusalem a cup of trembling and a burdensome stone. And so this slichot fits around Jerusalem, the rising again of Jerusalem, or the liberation of Jerusalem that's coming when Christ comes. And so as we approach Rosh Hashanah, I'll tell you, we are very close, very close. If we got a year to a day, soon this old world is going to hear the shout and the trumpet sound.
Yeah, I'll tell them exactly the year. If you follow the calendar, the Rosh Hashanah appears in which year?
1997, 98, we'll see.